Just want to do one example of a change in equilibrium, and this is just going to be one example to give you an idea of how to think about it and how to work with the model. And really how you get good at economics is you do example after example to slowly build up the intuition. So I'm going to do one example, and it's going to be an example of an increase in government expenditures. But what you should definitely do is go back after you've convinced yourself you understand what the effect of an increase in government expenditures is. You should go back and do an example of a decrease in government expenditures. If you can get that example at the level of detail we do up here at the board, then that's a really good sign, and you should start thinking about other types of examples. Well, suppose I don't change government expenditures. What if it's consumption that changes? Or what if you change taxes or something along those lines? Those are the types of things that you should be doing to build up intuition and get better at the model. Because at exam time, I'm going to ask a question that probably we haven't talked specifically about in class, but it's going to be based upon the loanable funds model. And if you've figured out how to use the model and work with it, you should be fine with the question. But if the only thing you do is you go through only the examples I do in class, then you're going to probably be underprepared for the exam. So let's just go ahead and do an example of, say, an increase in government expenditures. And it could be for any reason. It could be an increase in government expenditures due to war. That's a classic example. Or maybe the government decides to spend more on health care. Or maybe the government decides to spend more on building roads and bridges or hire more teachers or things of that nature. It doesn't really much matter. The key point is the government is spending more on goods and services here. So there's an increase in government spending. All right. So that's going to be my example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have certain description of what's going on over here on my left-hand side of the board. And on the right-hand side of the board, I'm going to have the diagram showing you what's going on. So let's just go ahead and get started. So I'm going to have some investment demand curve, some national savings curve. There's going to be some equilibrium real interest rate. And there's going to be some equilibrium level of investment and savings. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, this is the initial real interest rate that I'm going to label R1. I'm going to label this initial equilibrium A. And I'm going to just say, at A, the quantity of national savings, S1, is equal to the quantity demand of loanable funds, I1. Okay? So quantity supply equals quantity demand. Make that a little bit bigger. And I'm here. All right. So I'm going to start, and I'll label this as 1. I'm going to do this in outline format so you have a sense of what I think are the major points. You don't have to, at an exam time, give this back to me in an outline format. I just generally put it in an outline format because it makes it easier for students to learn the material. So there's the initial equilibrium at point A. As I said, what makes point A initial equilibrium is because quantity demand or quantity supply of loanable funds equals quantity demand of loanable funds, since that's the case. Now, in this case, there's an increase in government spending on goods and services. I don't know why. Could be war, increased healthcare expenditures, increased spending on roads, bridges, education, whatever. The point is the government is spending more, holding everything else constant. So we haven't changed taxes. We haven't changed consumption expenditures. We haven't changed real GDP. All of that is being held constant, right? Well, if you increase government expenditures, this isn't actually an example we did a few minutes ago. If you increase government expenditures, then that's going to end up decreasing national savings, all right? So what's going to end up happening? So the national savings curve is going to shift left. So S shifts left from S1 to S2. All right. Now, I'm not going to immediately jump to the new equilibrium. Okay? And the reason I'm not going to do that is I want you to explain how the market moves from one equilibrium to another. So I'm going to say, for the sake of argument, let's say the real interest rate stays the same. So the new real interest rate is the same as the old one. R1 is exactly the same as R2. Well, if that's the case, then the economy is going to move from not from point A up to this equilibrium. It's going to move from point A over here to point B. So I'll go ahead and call that point B. Okay. So the national savings curve is going to go ahead and shift to the left from S1 to S2. Therefore, we now need to figure out, is there a shortage in this market, or is there going to be a surplus of loanable funds? Well, to know whether there's a shortage or surplus, you have to be able to find quantity demand and quantity supply. So let's just go ahead and find the new quantity supplied of loanable funds. Well, if the real interest rate is R2 and the national savings curve shifts to the left, and remember, once the government spending goes up and the national savings curve shifts to the left, this national savings curve, the initial one, S1, ceases to be relevant. It's almost like it doesn't exist anymore. You can just mentally blot it out and pay no attention to it. All right? So if you completely eliminate that national savings curve, you've just completely blotted it out of your mind, then if you need to find the quantity supplied of national savings, there's only one national savings curve left. That's S2. Well, if you go from the real interest rate R2 to the national savings curve S2, you end up at point B, and that means the quantity supplied of national savings is going to be S2. All right? Well, what's going to be the quantity demand of loanable funds? In other words, how much investment households and firms want to go ahead and do? Well, if the real interest rate is R2 and the investment demand curve has not changed at all, then it shouldn't surprise you is when you go from the real interest rate to the investment demand curve, you actually end up at point A, and then you go down, the quantity demand of loanable funds hasn't changed. So the amount of investment that the economy wants to conduct is still I2. So that means the amount of savings is now less than the amount of investment that households want to go ahead and do. And i.e., and we just did this example, a shortage exists. That means there are some households and or firms out there in the economy who would like to borrow at this interest rate who can't. And excuse me. And the reason they can't is not enough households want to save at that low interest rate. All right. 3. So there's a shortage. Well, how do markets respond to a shortage? Well, we just did this. If there's a shortage, that means some borrowers have an incentive to bid up the price. So some borrowers have an incentive to bid up the real interest rate. Why? Because if there's a shortage, some people want to borrow who can't get it. There's some people out there who want to borrow to get a house, but they can't. Well, if you're someone who wants to borrow, how do you convince Bank of America to make a loan to you rather than someone else? You offer to pay a higher real interest rate. That's the one thing that you have that you can use to distinguish yourself from all the other potential borrowers out there. The same thing's true of firms. If Ford wants to build a new factory but can't get the funds at the current interest rate, how do they go ahead and convince financial markets to loan to them rather than someone else? They offer to pay more. Okay? Well, then there's going to be an increase in the real interest rate. Right? So now I know why the real interest rate is going to rise. There's a shortage, so some borrowers have an incentive to bid up the real interest rate. So as the real interest rate starts rising, think about what's happening in the diagram. It's exactly what we went through before, except we've just added the complexity here of actually shifting the supply curve. So as the real interest rate goes up, we're going to start moving up along our new national savings curve, which means the quantity of national savings is going to start to increase. Why? Because the higher real interest rate acts as a signal to households that savings is worth more now. The reward for savings is now higher than it was before. Do more of it. And the higher real interest rate at the margin is going to lead some households to cut back on consumption and do more savings. So the increase in the real interest rate is going to do two things. It's going to increase the quantity supplied of loanable funds, i.e., increase S, all right? And at exactly the same time, the real interest rate is the cost of borrowing. So the higher real interest rate is also going to act as a signal to people on the demand side of the market saying, hey, these loanable funds are now scarcer than they were before. Use less of them. And as the real interest rate goes up, some firms are going to say, you know what? At the low real interest rate, we had a bunch of investment projects we wanted to pursue, but at a higher real interest rate, it's not worth it. They're no longer profitable. So they'll drop out of the market. Same thing's happening on the to households who want to borrow for new residential housing. Some people want to get new housing at low interest rates, but when the interest rate starts rising, they say, you know what, it's just too expensive. We'll go ahead and keep renting, or we'll stay in our old house for a while. The important point is the higher real interest rate is going to end up decreasing the quantity demand of loanable funds, i.e., decrease investment. So you're going to start moving along your old investment demand curve, so the quantity demand of investment is going to start decreasing. Now, notice as the quantity supplied of national savings increases and the quantity demand of investment or loanable funds decreases, the size of the shortage is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And when is the shortage going to completely disappear? When will borrowers no longer have an incentive to bid up the real interest rate? When the shortage completely disappears. When is the shortage going to completely disappear? When we hit this new point, point C, which happens to be the equilibrium, where the real interest rate has risen all the way to R3, and now, because of the higher real interest rates, the quantity of national savings has risen to S3, and the quantity demanded of loanable funds, or the quantity demand of investment, has fallen to I3. Okay? So what's happened here is if you take a look at this example, and I should do for stop, and this is at new equilibrium. And what's so special about the new equilibrium is you're at point C where S3, the new quantity supplied of loanable funds, equals I3, the new quantity demand of loanable funds. Right? So if you think about what we did, we just gave a pretty nice explanation for why interest rates change in the economy, or real interest rates changed in the economy. We've got this loanable funds model that shows the supply side of loanable funds and the demand side of loanable funds. And when those curves shift, for whatever reason, in this case we did a shift of the national savings curve because government spending changes. When those curves shift around, that's going to cause shortages and surplus in markets, and markets by themselves get rid of those shortages and surpluses by adjusting the real interest rate. So the real interest rate is always going to adjust to move us back towards equilibrium, so it's always going to adjust to keep the level of savings equal to the level of investment in the economy. All right, so the last thing I wanted to say is I did one example here of an increase in government spending. You could go ahead through and do this and do, rather than an increase in government spending, you could do an increase in consumption expenditures. So households just decide they want to go ahead and consume more. You will get exactly the same answer, right? Or you could do anything that, basically anything that shifts the national savings curve to the left is going to have exactly the same effect, okay? So what you should do is you should go back, you should once convince yourself that you can do these examples of an increase in government expenditures, and then ask yourself, all right, can I do the next obvious example of a decrease in government expenditures? So suppose the government decides it wants to balance the budget for some reason and decrease government expenditures. Can you go ahead and do that? And then, once you've done that, you should start asking yourself, can I do an example where the investment demand curve shifts? So you should use this as a sort of your model for how to tackle these types of problems. The other thing I want to say before we're done is we talked about an increase in government expenditures, right? Notice what the end result is. Higher real interest rate, lower investment spending. So the classic criticism of government spending and government budget deficits, and we'll talk more about this when we do fiscal policy in more detail, is that higher government expenditures crowd out private investment expenditures, which means the economy is going to do less investment. And over time, if the economy keeps investing less, the capital stock will slowly begin to shrink, and that'll have an effect on real GDP in the long run and a standard of living in the long run. So this is sort of like our first model that's going to allow us to address fiscal policy in a way that the way economists tend to think about it. So we're going to come back to this loanable funds model later on when we start talking about fiscal policy.